Ladies and gentlemen, in a quiet room in Reykjavik, two men sat across from each other. No words, no emotions, just the board and the battle to come. Boris Spassky, the reigning world champion, flawless, composed, a titan of classical chess. He'd seen every style, every kind of player, but never one like this. Enter Bobby Fischer, the challenger, the anomaly, sharp, relentless, unshakably confident, a man who studied alone, played alone, and came to win. The match had already seen its share of chaos, protests, withdrawals, unexpected brilliance, but none of it prepared the world for what was about to happen. Game 6. For the first time, Fischer held the white pieces. In a moment that stunned even his closest followers, he opened with the Queen's Gambit, a line he had barely touched in his career. What followed was not a fight, but a masterclass. With every move, Fischer dismantled the champion's defenses, not with violence, but with elegance. He didn't just win the game, he composed it. Every piece moved like a piece of a greater whole. Every decision carried weight, purpose, harmony. Spectators leaned in, analysts stopped speaking. And at the end, Spassky didn't shake his head. He applauded. Because this wasn't just a victory. This was chess at its most beautiful. A game so perfect it transcended rivalry. This is not just a chapter in chess history. This is game 6, Spassky versus Fischer, and it's time to witness the masterpiece. So, without further ado, let's dive right into the game. We do not start with an immediate Queen's Gambit, but we do transpose into one in a Catalan style thing. And Bobby Fischer immediately disappoints me and plays knight to c3. See, the typical move here is g3, where you follow up with bishop to g2, and try to control over this diagonal. Here, there are a few responses, by the way. You can play c6, or knight f6, and various other sidelines like bishop to e7. But this is the main move, where white typically and follows up with bishop to g3 and bishop to g2. And a typical line would be something like this, where there are three options now. You can either play here, play c6, or you can castle. So, in this case, if you castle, this is called the open Catalan, where white immediately tries to take advantage with knight to e5 and sometime in the near future. Castles, which is just the Catalan mainline, and c6, which is the closed Catalan, where black kind of plays a triangle system to defend his pawns against white's bishop. This is preferably the best opening against the Catalan, but I am a Catalan follower, so I shall not play anything against the Catalan. So, we have knight to c3. This is like, those garbage Queen's Gambit openings. They don't even have a purpose, to be honest. I mean, they're just literally a better London. I'm sorry, London lovers, but your London kind of sucks. It's just garbage. Instead, we have bishop to e7, bishop to g5 castles, and this is kind of just a typical thing. White develops the piece and, wants the castle, e3, etc. You typical Londoners should know this kind of stuff. We have e3, this kind of stuff. And now this interesting move b6 with the idea of bishop to b7, and he wants to open up this diagonal and try to gain an advantage based on this open file. And instead, Fischer doesn't allow this, and he opens the file for the bishop, but a bit later, this file is now completely closed. So bishop to b7 is now rendered useless, and after a few trades, Fischer isn't really scared of anything along this e-file because bishop to e2 and castles will immediately get him out of danger if he must. So we have rook to c1, and this is a typical idea in the Queen's Gambit opening where you basically want to take advantage of the c6 square with knight to e5, knight to c6, etc., etc., and you want to play like bishop to e5 and stuff. By the way, if you don't want to play this b6 opening, you should probably just play the closed Catalan. Not too late for that. Where your idea should be in a typical closed Catalan or triangle system style: knight to d7, knight to b6, etc., rook to e8, and maybe e5 in the future if you get lucky. But of course, I would never recommend b6 in my life because b6 is a garbage move. I do not care if you're Boris Spassky. Not care if you're like Bobby Fischer. I do not care if you're an alien rated 4,000. You are garbage. But instead, we have this kind of line, and with the idea I explained, and bishop to e6. So the idea is that bishop to b7 basically does nothing, and bishop to e6 is therefore better because the bishop is more active. One defect of this move is that now the c6 square is less defended, and therefore it is easier to infiltrate with moves like queen to a4, bishop to b5, knight to c6, etc. Now, another instructive moment. In times like this, where you're black, a typical idea in this kind of structure is c5, where now you can easily perish the threat of anything on c6 with rook to c8, and plus you get a striking move, which is usually get in this position. The drawbacks is that um, the it doesn't really take complete control of the c5 square, and it is still pretty vulnerable. And plus, now these light squares are extremely vulnerable, and extremely easy to take control of. And if you have heard anything about this game, this is literally a light squared masterclass. We have queen to a3, another typical idea. You pin the pawn, and your idea is, and your thought is to put more pressure on this pawn by, um, some moves like b4, takes, and maybe knight to e2, knight to b3. Maybe we'll castle and double on this file soon. There are a lot of different ideas you can play in this position, but the most prominent of all is bishop to v5 and taking and castling. So, I'll go back a few moves and explain what happened. So, black, Boris Spassky is simply keeping control. I would rather like to see a move. I don't know what's happening. I would rather like to see a move like knight to d7, where you defend the pawn and you don't have to deal with any kind of pins, which you'll see happens later. So, like if bishop to b5, then a6 immediately kicks out the bishop, and you're essentially just fine. Oh my god. And you are essentially just fine. So, instead, we have rook to c8 here, which is kind of faulty, bishop to b5 and a6, and this actually doesn't threaten anything because of the pin on the a8 square. We have dc5, bc5, and castles. Now Fischer is going to leave this bishop here as long as he can, and just simply continue with development, because his idea is that Boris will have to spend a useless move kicking out his bishop, but actually there is the interesting queen to b5, queen to b7, which gets rid of the pin and attacks the bishop. And now after something like bishop to d3, you can just simply continue with development. You might be scared of this open b file, but to Bozo there is nothing to be scared of, because even if you play rook to b1, just like simply continue with queen to c7. And if here, you still have a beautiful file. Even though white has something, it's not something to be scared of necessarily. So instead, we have rook to a7. So Spassky, in a really faulty way, I would never recommend this yet again, unconnects his rooks from anything ever again. Even doubling wouldn't do anything. It's not necessarily a good idea to double in this situation. And he defends his rook in this kind of weird way. We have bishop to e2, knight to d7, developing the knight. Typical stuff. Knight to d4, using the pin yet again. And as long as Spassky doesn't deal with this mischievous pin, Fischer is just going to keep on using it, like with knight to d4, and he's going to now double. And even though black can double, it's, as I mentioned earlier, pretty useless, because you kind of just leave this side of the board completely in ruins. We have queen to f8. This might seem like a pretty stupid move, and it probably is, but the idea is to take care of this, and maybe now you have an open file. But the thing I don't understand about this move is that there's literally a stupid rook. Like, even if you get f4, f5, there's literally a rook backing up, and you have a queen. Like, it's not going to do anything. So we have we so he takes the piece, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a light squared masterclass. So obviously taking advantage of the light squares by taking the bishop is the correct decision when you know you're going to completely roll Spassky. Now, an interesting idea here, which is e4. Your idea is to break up this pawn structure and play something like queen to e3, where white has a great chance of winning all three of these pawns back and having a 2 pawn advantage, though it won't be as easy to win the second pawn. We have d4 pushing forward, but now, if you know anything about chess, I don't care how advanced this concept is, everybody knows it. If you have more pawns on one color, the opposite color of your pawns, or the opposite color complex of your pawns, are weaker. So in this case, the light squares are weak. That means that you should be prioritizing your light squared bishop's development over any other bishop. Plus, also, you might have a chance of getting this e6 pawn to move forward if you continue with like f4, f5, which happens in the game necessarily. And we have f4 and e5. So now Fischer decides he's going to lock this pawn in, so this pawn can never move or get a life like you. And so it's pretty easy to target this pawn now with bishop to c4 and f5, which will happen in the game as we will see, but there needs to be preparations. So he plays this move, and now king to h8 is a pretty sneaky move getting out of the way, but it's not sneaky enough for Fischer. He plays one of Iwi's probably favorite moves, and he attacks the e6 pawn, and actually, in a battle of passed pawns, Fischer's pawns are more dominant because firstly, Fischer has an attack on this side, which is more aggressive than anything Boris can ever think of doing. Plus, these pawns have more, kind of backup rather than these two hanging pawns. This was a hanging pawn structure eventually before the pawn moved down to d4, but now it is not. And if you have studied anything about hanging pawns, you know that d5 is usually played in the d4 is usually played in the endgame, which it is now, but it can easily be blockaded if the I made up this rule. So you kind of create a right triangle, which is one of Hikaru's famous rules, but it's a bit different. So you take these 2 pawns, and now you can make a square, I guess. Make a square, and then the opposite colored squares are weak, and you need to place a bishop on the right triangle setup like this. It needs to be facing left right triangle, and you need to place the bishop right there so it monitors everything on this diagonal like a security guard. And here we have, instead of taking, which would give Fischer a big advantage, we have knight to f8, which is a futile attempt in defending this pawn, which doesn't go on very long because Fischer finds the amazing b3, not the amazing b3, that is just a regular move, after a5, because Boris has nothing. This is a really good positional idea. You basically make your opponent's position so bad that they can't do anything. Now, by anything, I mean, obviously they can improve their position, but their improvements are going to be less effective than yours. So, we have a5, which is kind of a flailing move, and Fischer times his strike beautifully, and this is where this kind of game goes for a turn. We have ef5, rook f5, which is going to be followed up with rook cf1, and a kind of, don't blame me for this, Alekhine's gun structure with rook to f4 and queen to f3. I don't think Alekhine made this idea. I think he just used it primarily in his game, but I don't know where they got the idea of Alekhine's gun. Don't ask me. But still, so you have rook to f5 with that idea, knight to b7, knight to h7, and this is the kind of when your opponent plays a5 and knight to h7, they have nothing to do. In that case, you should never ever strike forward with g4 and g5 and try to attack them. Instead, you should positionally build until they actually have a decent plan, which and and also you need to be careful in the case where they have the plan that contradicts your plan. So you need to engage your plan before they can actually do anything. Also, an important thing I would like to bring up here is that Fischer is kind of as you can see, he's reducing all of Boris's light squared pieces because of an idea which has been introduced many times. If you take any sport, let's say you have, okay, this is like contradictory, but 100,000 people on each team, and one guy was like sick or something. So there's 99,999 to 100,000. So obviously the team at 100,000 has something of advantage, but it is nothing like the 99,999 team could easily win, even if like 100 of their people were gone. But if you keep on reducing it, let's say we go down to 10 now, 10 to 9, 7 to 8, 6 to 5, blah, 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 until, of course, the minimal case, 1 to 0, where 1 will always win, but also 2 to 1 is a huge advantage. So let's count all the pieces that can defend light squares right now. 1, 2, 3, 4, and I'm not counting rooks because rooks are primarily for files and not the pieces. And this pawn is going to be eliminated, so I won't include it. 1, 2, 3. So you see, Spassky is basically going to try to trade off the rooks and probably positionally dominate, or he is going to easily win an endgame where he busts open the king side, which is of course a huge piece of chess, king safety. And as we can see, if we compare king safety, um white is obviously winning. Also, one important part I want to mention is I, like many people recommend, have created a series, uh you 5 steps to check if you're winning or losing, or based on the evaluation, because making a basic evaluation of the position in your mind is a really important concept. So these are my 5 criteria, from most important to least important. We have both king safety and material at the same level. We have pawn structure right below that in my idea. We have square weaknesses right below pawn structure, because square weaknesses usually come from deficiencies in pawn structures. Then we have space. Space usually isn't great for me. I don't know how to play a space. So I usually look for these kind of factors. Well, I like to take advantage of pawn structure and squares and things like that. So in this case, we can see that pawn structure is obviously on Fischer's side. Space also, I guess, because Spassky is in a corner. And so the rule is that, like in chess, we're going to make a material system. So I'm going to start from 5 points. Material and king safety are both worth 5 points. Then below that, pawn structure and weaknesses are both worth 2 points or 1 point, depending on your kind of preference. And then space is worth 1 point. So if we compare, I don't see any clear advantage for Spassky. So Spassky has 0 points right now, where Fischer obviously has the space advantage, which is 1 point, the king safety advantage, as he has a pretty decent attack if he keeps it brewing, which is 5 points. I mean 6 points total, plus the two pawn structure and weaknesses, which I'll take 2 points each, which is 10 points. So it's 10 to 0, which means the farther it gets, obviously, the more the other person is winning. And so that means Fischer, in this case, has a pretty clear advantage if it's at 10. You could say probably clearly better. And in a positional standpoint, I am correct. He's clearly better. But the problem is that many people don't know how to convert this position, where you have these kind of positional advantages. That's why I feel like this game is so brilliant, because you see kind of how you should keep an eye out for how Fischer converts this position with a positional advantage, while many people love playing with attacking styles. So we are going to play b3, blah blah blah. We saw this, and now rook takes with a beautiful idea, and we have queen to d8 and queen to g3. Queen to d8, again, a kind of move where you see that Spassky has basically no idea, and queen to g3. You might be questioning why I didn't play queen to f3. I don't know really either, but maybe he wanted to initiate, maybe wanted to go closer with queen to g3 and rook to f2 first, which is, of course, a viable idea. And so we have rook to e7, probably preparing to double. And so rook, wait, what? Oh, okay, I didn't see that. I'm sorry. There's just something blocking my thing. So h4. And so, again, Fischer is going for the position approach with h5, and he's going to kind of anchor his thing in. But obviously, I think queen to g3 is much, much better in this position. Even though the engine doesn't give it such a clear advantage, I think that probably just like this, e6, and this is clearly winning. But he goes for a slow, maybe just he was flexing or something, in e6, and the eventual demolition of the position. And you see, if you allow black any counterplay, this is a really important concept too. Many people are scared of, um, trying to hold or really bad at making counterplay. So you should really do whatever you need to do to take counterplay measures, like sacrificing your pieces or trying to approach on your opponent's king while diverse, like moving your pieces to another side. But you have to also try to keep things simple with the other side and not go for clarity or beauty when you are playing with that side. We have queen to d8, rook to f2, and Fischer's just like flexing at this point. This is no. And he flexes, he sacrifices, and he demolishes Spassky. And so here, Spassky stands up, applauds, and the game ends with an eventual win for Fischer, I believe. Thank you for your viewership. Like and subscribe. See you later, and now get out of here.